Today, we're going to take an unforgettable journey through 6 powerful encounters, all packed into one chapter of the Bible, Luke 18. Now, our goal isn't just to read these stories. Oh no. It's to make them so vivid, so real in your mind's eye, that they stick with you long after this is over. So let's dive in.
So, here's our roadmap. We'll start with a widow's relentless demand for justice. Then we'll compare 2 men praying in the temple. After that, a surprising lesson from children, followed by a rich man's really big question. Then things get a little mysterious with a puzzling prophecy, and we'll finish with the desperate shout of a blind man.
All right, our journey begins with a story from Jesus himself, a parable about a woman who absolutely refuses to back down and a judge who, well, just couldn't care less. The main idea here is clear from the get-go. Persistence is everything. Okay, so verse 1 kicks it off, and Jesus tells us the point of the story right up front. Always pray and don't lose heart. Picture a candle flame, flickering like it's about to go out, and then suddenly it roars back to life. That's the vibe. Now, verse 2 introduces our first character, a judge. Imagine this guy in a dark, imposing courtroom, slumped in his giant chair, totally bored. He doesn't care about God, he doesn't care about people. Then, in verse 3, our hero enters, a widow. She might be small, but picture her standing there, determined, her voice ringing out, demanding justice. Verse 4 shows us a little montage. Day after day, the judge just waves her away, like swatting a fly. But then we get to verse 5. Zoom in on the judge's annoyed face. He's had it. He finally says, Okay, I'll give her what she wants, not because it's right, but just so she'll finally leave me alone.
So in verse 6, Jesus turns to the crowd and says, "Did you catch that? Listen to what even this terrible judge said." Now, verse 7 is where the scene totally flips. Imagine that dark, cold courtroom dissolving, replaced by this bright, warm scene of God leaning in, listening intently to every single prayer. The contrast is huge. Jesus is saying if a corrupt judge will eventually give in, how much more will a loving God who hears his people day and night bring about justice? And then verse 8 hits with a flash of light as he says, "speedily." But it ends with this huge, haunting question. Picture the whole earth with a single glowing question mark hovering over it. When the time comes, will this kind of persistent, never give up faith even be found?
From the persistence of that widow, our scene now shifts. We're heading into the temple. And here, Jesus gives us this powerful, side-by-side comparison of 2 men, 2 prayers, and 2 hearts that are worlds apart.
So, verse 9 tells us exactly who this story is for. People who were pretty sure they had it all figured out, spiritually speaking. In verse 10, we see the 2 men. Picture one guy in these elaborate, fancy robes, the Pharisee, striding right up to the front. The other, a tax collector, is in simple clothes, kind of hiding in the back. Then verses 11 and 12 zoom in on the Pharisee. He's standing tall, chin up, and he's not so much praying as he is, well, reading off his spiritual resume. He's listing all his good deeds, probably looking around to make sure everyone else can hear how great he is.
But now, in verse 13, the camera pans over to the tax collector. He's way in the back, in the shadows. His head is bowed. He's so ashamed he won't even look up toward heaven. And then you see his fists just thumping against his chest in this gesture of genuine, heart-wrenching sorrow, and he chokes out the only prayer he has. God, be merciful to me, a sinner. It's raw, it's real, and it's powerful.
So, what's the verdict? Verse 14 gives us this great reversal. Jesus says it was the humble tax collector, the one who knew he was broken, who went home right with God, not the guy who looked so perfect on the outside. And this just perfectly illustrates this huge principle. If you puff yourself up, you'll be brought down. But if you humble yourself, you'll be lifted up.
Right on the heels of that lesson on humility, we get another short but incredibly powerful real-life example. The focus shifts from these respected men in the temple to, well, the most overlooked people in society, little kids.
Okay, verse 15. Picture this. Parents are eagerly bringing their little babies to Jesus, and the disciples step in, acting like overzealous security guards trying to block them. But in verse 16, Jesus just smiles, overrules them, and says, No, let them come, welcoming all the kids with open arms. And then comes the big lesson in verse 17. To make this stick, imagine a really small gate. A little child can just walk right through, no problem. But an adult trying to carry all their pride and accomplishments just can't fit. That's the point. You have to receive the kingdom with that same simple, trusting heart of a child.
Our next scene introduces a man who seems to have everything going for him. He's sincere, he's rich, he's a leader, and he comes to Jesus with what is probably life's most important question.
So in verse 18, this really earnest ruler comes up and asks, "What do I have to do to get eternal life?" In verses 19 and 20, Jesus starts with the basics, listing off the core commandments that everyone would know. And in verse 21, the ruler answers with this real confidence. Yep, done all those, kept every single one since I was a kid. In his mind, he's checked every single box.
And then, verse 22, this is the moment everything changes. Jesus looks at him and says, "You're missing just one thing. Sell everything you own, give it to the poor, and come, follow me." Now, as he hears this, just imagine all his beautiful possessions suddenly morphing into this giant, heavy anchor, chaining him right to the spot. Verse 23 tells us what happens next. The light just drains from his face. He turns and walks away, heartbroken, because his great wealth suddenly feels like an impossible burden.
So in verse 24, Jesus watches him go, and then he turns to his disciples. He's about to make a point they will never forget. Verse 25 gives us this wild, unforgettable image. Just picture it, a literal, massive camel trying to squeeze its entire body through the tiny eye of a sewing needle. It's absurd, it's comical, it's impossible, and that is exactly his point. That's how hard it is for someone who puts their trust in riches to enter God's kingdom.
You can imagine the disciples are just floored. In verse 26, they ask, "Well, who can be saved then?" And Jesus' answer in verse 27 is profound. Imagine a huge, solid stone wall with the word impossible carved into it. Then, with a single touch from God, it transforms into an open doorway. See, what's impossible for us is possible for him. Then, in verse 28, Peter chimes in, "Hey, what about us? We left everything to follow you." And in verses 29 and 30, Jesus assures them that the reward is so much greater. It's a new, vibrant family and community that's worth more than anything they left behind.
Okay, after explaining the true cost and the incredible reward of following him, the whole mood shifts. It gets really serious. Jesus pulls his 12 closest friends aside to tell them something crucial about where they're heading, but it's a puzzle they won't be able to solve just yet.
So in verses 31 to 33, Jesus just lays out this grim, step-by-step path that lies ahead in Jerusalem. First, he says he'll be handed over. Second, he'll be mocked and insulted. Third, he'll be beaten and killed. It's a brutal, devastating prophecy. But it doesn't end there. The final step, the one that changes everything, is a bright promise. On the third day, he will rise again.
And yet, here's the crazy part in verse 34. Despite how clearly he said it, they didn't get it. Not one bit. It's like a thick fog just rolled in between Jesus and his disciples. The words were spoken, but the meaning was completely hidden from them. It was a total mystery. And from that fog of confusion, we snap right into a miracle they can't possibly ignore. This brings us to the final, climactic scene of the chapter. As Jesus gets close to Jericho, an encounter on the side of the road is about to bring everything we've talked about, faith, persistence, into sharp focus.
All right, verses 35 to 37 set the scene. There's a blind man, begging, and he hears this huge crowd coming. He asks what's going on, and someone tells him Jesus of Nazareth is passing by. He knows this is his one and only chance. So in verse 38, he cries out, his voice cutting through all the noise, "Jesus, Son of David, have mercy on me." Now look at verse 39. The people in the crowd try to shush him, tell him to be quiet. But does he listen? No way. He just cries out even louder. He's pulling a page right out of that widow's book, isn't he? He will not be ignored.
And then this incredible moment in verse 40. Jesus stops. The entire procession, the whole crowd, grinds to a halt for this one man. Jesus has him brought over, and in verse 41, he asks him this incredibly powerful, direct question. "What do you want me to do for you?" The man's answer is just as simple and direct. "Lord, I want to see." Then in verse 42, picture a wave of pure light moving from Jesus to the man's eyes as he says the words, "Receive your sight. Your faith has made you well." And verse 43 tells us it happened instantly. The man's eyes fly open in wonder. And what's the very first thing he does? He joins the crowd and follows Jesus, just praising God at the top of his lungs. And his healing just sparks this chain reaction. A wave of praise just ripples through the entire crowd. It's a visible, powerful end to a journey that started with unseen faith.
So as we wrap up this journey through Luke 18, think about it. We saw a widow who wouldn't quit, a tax collector who humbled himself, and a blind man who refused to be silenced. We also saw a Pharisee who thought he was perfect, and a rich ruler who couldn't let go. All of them were asking for something: justice, mercy, eternal life, sight. So the question this chapter really leaves us with is this: what do all their stories, taken together, teach us about how we should ask?